Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the High Court is due to rule this morning on whether the NHS in England should have to fund a drug that can help to prevent the spread of HIV. The treatment called PrEP has been shown to reduce the risk of HIV transmission by 86%. But the NHS has argued it is not its responsibility to fund the drug, that local authorities should pay for it. PrEP is used in several other countries to help protect gay men from HIV. Here's a look at what PrEP is in a little more detail.
PrEP. It stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis. It's a daily pill taken to reduce the risk of getting HIV. The drug is intended for people who are at high risk of contracting the virus, for example, someone who's in a relationship with a partner who's HIV positive. There are around 100,000 people living in the UK with HIV. If taken correctly, PrEP is almost entirely effective in preventing HIV. It has an 86% success rate. A UK trial was set up to see how effective PrEP would be in preventing HIV transmission among gay men. The study was a huge success and was actually brought to an early close because it's unethical to continue trialling medicine on people when a clear result has already been found, and it was obvious that PrEP worked. Many believe that even after the trial ended, NHS England, which is the body that's responsible for many funding decisions in the NHS, would continue to fund the drug for people most at risk of contracting HIV. But in March 2016, NHS England said that PrEP was a preventative service and wasn't its responsibility. The National AIDS Trust, a charity for people living with HIV, launched a legal challenge, and it's that result that we're expecting later today.
Well, let's talk now to Yusuf Asad from the National AIDS Trust, which has led the legal challenge against the NHS, and Nick Perry, who has been taking PrEP as part of the drugs trial called PROUD. Thank you both very much for joining us. This case centres, this judgment today will focus solely on whether the NHS is legally able to fund this drug, isn't it? Because the NHS says it's actually not legally its responsibility, it's the responsibility of local authorities.
That's right. And in fact, the NHS in 2014 began the process of deciding whether to commission PrEP and carried on that process for 18 months, claiming that they were up for it as long as they decided it was cost effective. But then suddenly, the final decision was due in June, just a month or two ago. But in March, as was just said, they suddenly turned around, abandoned the decision-making process and said that they decided they didn't have the legal power to do prevention. That came as a great surprise to everybody. We don't agree that they're right in law, and that's why we've gone to judicial review, and we're looking forward to the judgment later this morning.
So obviously this hearing has not been exploring the arguments around the sort of viability of prescribing, whether it's worth it in practical terms in the way that the NICE committee would look at funding drugs on the NHS. But
absolutely.
What's your argument for why it is the NHS's responsibility rather than local authorities?
Well, we believe in law the NHS can do prevention, and in fact Simon Stevens, the Chief Executive of the NHS, has been stressing how important prevention is, and the NHS has a job to do there. It's always cheaper to prevent rather than treat, and that's true for HIV as well. People will tend to be on PrEP for a short period of time, and it's much cheaper to give PrEP for a temporary period rather than pay for a lifetime cost of treating someone who gets HIV. So for us it makes sense from a public health point of view, and it makes sense from an economic point of view as well.
There are of course condoms that are provided free on the NHS, which are always put forward as, you know, the safe way for anybody to have sex, to protect not just against pregnancy but also sexually transmitted diseases. What's wrong with using condoms?
Nothing wrong with using condoms. We must continue to use condoms. Condoms have been promoted for 30 years. They've been essential in containing the epidemic, and they'll continue to be so. We must continue to promote them. PrEP isn't about replacing condoms. It's about adding to condom use. With all the condom promotion and all the condom use, we're still seeing 17 people every day in the UK newly diagnosed with HIV. Condoms slip, condoms break, people move on from condoms for greater intimacy. Only a minority of the sexually active population use condoms consistently 100% of the time. So if we want to see a change in rates of transmission, the game change that we need in the HIV epidemic, we need to add to condom use, and that's where PrEP comes in.
Nick, you've been using PrEP for the last 2.5 years as part of that trial. What are the benefits that you would say of it?
For me, it's about decision making and taking control of my own sexual health. Perhaps it's because I was around as a child in the 80s when AIDS was pitched as something quite sinister. There is a fear around sex. I came out quite late, and that's possibly because I was afraid of, quite irrationally, that just having sex would give me HIV. For me, this is a decision I take when I'm brushing my teeth in the morning, to take that pill every day. The decision to use a condom, which is something that I still try to do, I know it isn't perfect. And that's a decision that's made often in the heat of the moment, at the wrong time. It's not the best circumstances in which to make a sort of strategic decision about your sexual health. It can go wrong, all sorts of reasons. So for me, this is about me taking control of my sexual health unilaterally, alone, without discussion with someone else.
So would you describe this as being as liberating for gay men as the pill was for women in the 60s?
Not having been a woman in the 60s, perhaps I'm not qualified to say that, but certainly I feel it is very liberating for my own personal reasons. And I know plenty of other gay men that I've spoken to about it feel the same way, that this is about them not being afraid of sex anymore. We've come a long way in accepting that sex isn't about procreation. In the decades since then, gay sex has always been problematic because it carries with it a small risk, but one that is quite ferocious if it catches you.
When you look at the risk, taking this drug has reduced the transmission of HIV, the number of infections, by 86%, so there is still a 14% risk. Condoms are safer than that, aren't they?
Taken properly, this is nearly 100% effective. So this is all about the regime. There are all sorts of experiments around how you might want to take it, an event-based prescription, but taken every day, which I find very easy, although I have a little tray sorter there that with Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday on, take it once a day. In those circumstances, it's virtually 100% effective.
Tell us more about the statistics then, Yusuf, because 86% is the figure that's put out there.
Yes, that is the formal result of the PROUD trial for those who were in the PrEP arm of the trial who were meant to be taking PrEP. It was 86% because 3 people in the PrEP arm of the trial got HIV. But when the study researchers looked in more detail at those 3 men, they found that none of them were actually taking the PrEP at the time that they got HIV. So in other words, it wasn't that they were taking PrEP and it didn't work, it was that though they were meant to be taking PrEP in the study, they actually hadn't been taking PrEP at the time they got HIV. So it doesn't suggest that PrEP isn't effective or there's a 14% gap. All it shows is that you need to take it as prescribed. If you take it as prescribed, all the data shows it's more or less 100% effective at stopping you getting HIV.
£400 a month for the NHS. It's a big outlay.
It is.
And who would get it?
Well, to be cost effective, we need to make sure it's targeted at people at high risk. That's the first point. But if we do that...
So define that then.
Well, so that was what the working group was developing, some eligibility criteria before the whole process was abandoned. But for gay men, it would probably be the eligibility criteria that were developed was about having a recent instance of unprotected sex, likely to do it again, and having previously attended a sexual health clinic and had a negative HIV test. And the modelers at Public Health England say that that is sufficient to identify a high-risk group who would really benefit from PrEP. And as I said previously, you actually don't need to prevent many HIV transmissions to make PrEP very cost-effective. it's been calculated in a first full year of PrEP, you might have 4,000 men on PrEP. At the full cost price, which is only going to last another 18 months before the price comes down, but even at full cost price...
And then it would be, what, about £40 a month?
Well, it would certainly go down towards that because it will become generic. But let's just talk about it whilst it's on patent. 4,000 men on PrEP, you only need to stop 43 of them from getting HIV for it to pay for itself. So actually, when we think about cost, we need to think about the much greater cost of treating people if they get HIV.
What about the other aspect, Nick? If it, if it were widely available and it did give the protection, obviously, for people from HIV, so it therefore led to even less condom use, would that then lead potentially to an increase in other STDs and cause all other issues?
Other STIs occur through other forms of sex anyway. As I understood it in the PROUD trial, there was no statistically significant increase in other STIs. The small increase that was seen was attributed to the increased testing. Now, what goes alongside this is regular visits to the clinic, and that's all good for all sorts of other reasons. And so I don't see that as being a problem. The largest, the most significant risk, both in terms of costs to the NHS and in terms of effects on one's lifestyle, is clearly HIV, and those other STIs will, if they occur, be caught at those regular 3-monthly screenings that I would continue to have. So that doesn't, I have no fear of that.
I mean, just looking at the statistics, actually, and you spoke earlier about your fears of the risks of HIV transmission before you came out. In London, 1 in 8 sexual partners in someone's lifetime would have HIV. Nationwide, the figure's 1 in 26. So when you look at a statistic like that, it's easy to see the fear, obviously, of the risk out there.
That's at the forefront of my mind, especially living in London where that figure is so high. I mean, it is statistically almost impossible that of the men that I meet and talk to, that none of those have HIV. I believe 14% of them might not even know it. So a sexual encounter, even with somebody that I've had a long, meaningful conversation with about when they were last checked and whether they practice safe sex, they may be carrying it and not even knowing. And when the number is that high, and I think it's 1 in 11 in London under a new sort of counting regime, that's quite a frightening statistic for me. It may be that the person that I take in good faith as having had a test is carrying it unknowingly, or has had sex with someone else that's carrying it unknowingly. It's not just this single person that I meet that I have to trust. It's all the people they've slept with since they were last tested.
Callum has tweeted, say, it costs about £380,000 to treat an HIV-positive person over their lifetime. You'd have to take PrEP for 79 years to cost that. And Stephen has tweeted, people refusing to use condoms is not an excuse to force the NHS to pay £10 million to £20 million. Do you want to respond to those, Yusuf?
Well, obviously, the first one, I think, makes the point I was making, that actually it is cost-effective. And I think that in regard to the second, I think we need to move away from this idea of people refusing to use condoms as some sort of irresponsible act. I mean, I think there's a lot of people use condoms a lot of the time, but in the real world, it isn't 100%. And people wanting PrEP is a profoundly responsible act about your sexual health and the sexual health of your partners. If people are concerned about the money, let's boil it down to the economic argument and make the point, again, that if you provide PrEP to those at high risk of HIV, you are saving the NHS money, because the HIV treatment budget goes to hundreds of millions of pounds. If we can start getting down the number of HIV transmissions, which we're failing to do at the moment, by adding PrEP to our prevention armoury, we're actually going to be saving money in the long term, and everyone will benefit from that.
And if you win today, that is what it will boil down to, isn't it? Because it wouldn't be an automatic order for the NHS to fund it, would it? It would have to go through the usual scrutiny.
Exactly.
That applies.
So if we win this morning, then what happens is that the NHS decision-making process gets kick-started again. And they will think very carefully about all of the effectiveness, public health and cost-effectiveness arguments that we're all concerned about.
Lorenzo has tweeted, why should the NHS fund the drug when they can't fund other life-saving drugs and or treatment for cancer, etc.?
I don't think it's a trade-off between one condition and another.
With finite budgets, how do you choose life-saving treatment for cancer or this?
Well, we should pay for life-saving treatment for cancer, and we should pay for prevention. And I think as long as we refuse to do prevention and only fund treatment, we are never going to have enough money for treatment, including for life-saving cancer drugs. This is about protecting the NHS budget by some strategic investment to improve our response to the HIV epidemic and reduce the number of people who need lifelong HIV treatment. That will free up money for HIV treatment and for treatment for cancer and for all other drugs as well.
If it's not decided in the end that the NHS funds it, and obviously the NHS is arguing that it absolutely shouldn't be funding this because of legal responsibilities, what will you do, Nick? Because you've been getting it as part of a trial. Will you buy it privately? How can you?
I've got about a month's supply left. I can then go into the world wild web and find it for myself from online websites. I can import it for personal use, 3 months use. So I can get 90 pills for about £45 a bottle, with all the risks that come with that. Do I know the company that's supplying it? Do I know who's made it? Has it been quality checked? Is it effective? Is it the real thing? That's what I will have to do. Stretching to £43 a month will give me peace of mind. Awful lot of people that can't stretch to that £43 a month, or think that risk is too high because they don't know what they'll be taking.
And the reason it's so much cheaper to buy privately is because it's not the patented version that the NHS would have to buy, as
exactly.
you say.
If you buy online from overseas, you're buying from generic companies where the cost is cheaper. Yeah.
Thank you very much. A couple more tweets just before we stop this chat. Harry has tweeted, "It's absurd. If this disease affected mostly elderly people, the NHS would fund it immediately." And Callum has tweeted, "If you think the NHS can't afford PrEP, just consider how much it'll cost to treat and care for an HIV patient for life." Thank you both very much for coming in. The ruling is expected around 10:30, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we'll have that when it comes through. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Let me just tell you that we're just hearing from the courts that the National AIDS Trust has won its case against the NHS over the HIV prevention drug PrEP. The National AIDS Trust was arguing that the NHS should pay for that drug. The NHS had actually said that it was not even legally allowed to fund it because HIV prevention services are the domain of local authorities. So the NHS was fighting the prospect of funding that drug on that basis. The National AIDS Trust took a legal case and it's now won. It doesn't mean that the drug automatically gets funded by the NHS because I mean, there may obviously be an appeal, but even if there isn't an appeal, what would need to happen is that the issues around the viability of funding it and whether it is cost effective would need to be looked at by the NHS before it actually gets the go-ahead. But anyway, the National AIDS Trust has won that ruling at the High Court. We'll be there and we'll get you more on it as soon as we can. Let's go straight to our correspondent, Richard Galpin, who's outside the court for us. Richard, tell us then what this ruling will mean.
Well, I think it's very, very significant. Mr. Justice Green, the judge, has ruled in favour of the National AIDS Trust, you say, which brought this case to the High Court here. And he's saying essentially that the NHS England has made a mistake. He said that they had erred in deciding it did not have the power or the duty to commission the preventative drugs in issue, i.e. this PrEP drug, which is such a breakthrough in dealing with HIV. He's saying that the NHS in England does have a broad preventative role in treatment of HIV, and the NHS does have the power to commission these preventative treatments. So a pretty clear ruling from him. But Joanna, it's not the end of the story, because there is going to be an appeal. We think there's certainly the possibility of an appeal, which the judge was saying he wants to have done as quickly as possible. And then, of course, there's another stage, which is the NHS in England has to actually commission a drug, and they've been talking in the past about they have to deal with many new drugs, whether to commission them or not, and it's not clear how long that process would last. Certainly speaking to the National AIDS Trust, they're hoping it will be done as quickly as possible, so that in theory this drug could be available to everybody who needs it within the next few months by the autumn, but it could drag on for some time. It's really not clear at this stage.
Thank you very much.
I've been getting away with it all